Ironic. The very people who seem impossible to reach are often searching for the same connection they keep running from. An avoidant can appear calm on the surface, independent, confident, and completely unaffected by emotional distance. Yet beneath that carefully protected exterior is a conflict that few people ever understand. They want closeness, but fear what closeness might demand. They want connection, but panic when that connection starts feeling real. This is why so many relationships with avoidants follow the same frustrating pattern. Everything feels promising at first. The bond grows stronger, trust begins to form. Then suddenly, without warning, the distance begins. Messages become shorter. Conversations lose depth. Affection fades. The person who once seemed fully invested starts pulling away. Most people respond in the exact way avoidants secretly expect. They chase harder, they give more, they explain more, they try to prove their love. They believe that enough patience, enough understanding, and enough effort will eventually break down the walls. Yet the harder they push, the further the avoidant retreats. It becomes a cycle that leaves both people exhausted, confused, and emotionally drained. But hidden beneath all of this is a reality that relationship experts rarely discuss in detail. There is one type of empath that changes this entire dynamic. One type that affects avoidance in a way that surprises even the avoidants themselves. Not because this empath is more attractive, not because they are more persuasive, not because they play games or use manipulation. Their influence comes from a completely different source. In fact, the quality that makes them unforgettable is often the very thing most people are afraid to develop. And when an avoidant crosses paths with this empath, a shift begins that can challenge years of emotional habits and protective defenses. What makes this even more fascinating is that many empaths spend years becoming the exact opposite of this person. They believe being endlessly available is the answer. They believe sacrificing their own needs proves the depth of their love. They believe persistence will eventually create security. Yet these beliefs often create the very outcome they fear most. The avoidant feels pressured. The connection becomes unbalanced. The emotional distance grows larger. The empath gives more and receives less. But the empath we are talking about today operates differently. Their approach is quiet yet powerful, gentle yet firm, compassionate yet deeply rooted in self-respect. And that combination creates an effect that many avoidants are completely unprepared for. Throughout this video, we will uncover who this empath really is, and why their presence often leaves such a lasting impression. We will explore the hidden psychology behind avoidant behavior, and reveal why so many people misunderstand what is actually happening beneath the surface. You will discover why avoidants do not simply fear commitment in the way most people assume. You will learn about the deeper fear that drives their actions and shapes their relationships. We will also examine why traditional advice often fails when dealing with avoidant personalities, and how certain behaviors can unintentionally strengthen the very walls people are trying to break down. More importantly, we will reveal the specific traits that separate this rare empath from everyone else. These traits may seem simple at first, but their impact is far greater than most people realize. As we move deeper into this discussion, you will also discover the psychological shift that begins inside an avoidant when they encounter someone who refuses to abandon themselves for the sake of a relationship. This shift is rarely talked about because it happens internally. It is not always visible. It does not happen overnight. Yet it can force an avoidant to confront thoughts, feelings, and patterns they have spent years avoiding. There is also a lesser-known truth that many people never hear. Some avoidants spend much of their lives expecting others to adapt to their distance. They become familiar with being chased, familiar with being pursued, familiar with people fighting for their attention. But when they encounter an empath who values themselves enough to maintain healthy boundaries, the entire pattern changes. Suddenly, the rules they are used to no longer apply. The emotional script they have seen countless times before begins to break apart. That is when self-reflection often begins. That is when unanswered questions start appearing. That is when the avoidant may finally be forced to look inward instead of outward. By the end of this video, you will understand why the strongest empath is not always the most giving person in the room. You will see why emotional intelligence without self-respect can become self-destruction. You will learn why healthy empathy is very different from self-sacrifice, and why that distinction can completely transform relationships. Most importantly, you will discover why the empath who impacts avoidance the most is often the one who understands a simple truth that many people spend years trying to learn. A truth that has the power to change not only romantic relationships, but every connection in life. The final insight may completely change the way you view empathy, attachment, and emotional strength. So stay with us until the very end, because each piece of this puzzle builds toward a deeper understanding of why one specific empath type leaves such a powerful mark on avoidance, and why their influence continues long after the relationship itself has changed. If topics like empathy, psychology, human behavior, attachment styles, and personal growth interest you, then you are in the right place. Welcome to the channel. Be sure to subscribe and join our growing community for more powerful insights that help you better understand yourself and the people around you. Now let's uncover the one empath type that brings avoidance to their knees. To understand why one specific type of empath affects avoidance so deeply, it is necessary first to understand what is happening inside the avoidant mind. Many people see avoidance as cold, distant, or emotionally unavailable. They assume avoidants simply do not care. They assume avoidants enjoy keeping others at arm's length. But the reality is often much more complicated. Avoidant attachment is not usually built on a lack of feelings. In many cases, it is built on fear. A fear that developed long before the relationship ever began. Deep down, many avoidants learned that depending on other people could lead to disappointment, loss of freedom, emotional pain, or vulnerability. Over time, they adapted by becoming highly self-reliant. They learned to solve problems alone. They learned to suppress emotions. They learned to convince themselves that needing others was dangerous. From the outside, this can look like strength. It can look like independence. It can even look like confidence. But beneath that surface often exists an ongoing struggle between the desire for connection and the fear of becoming emotionally dependent on someone else. This is why avoidance can be so confusing in relationships. One moment they seem deeply interested. They open up. They engage. They show affection. They create emotional closeness. Then, as the connection becomes more real, something shifts. The very intimacy they wanted begins to feel uncomfortable. Their internal alarm system activates. They start needing space. They begin creating distance. They become harder to reach. For the other person, this change often feels sudden and unexpected. It feels like the avoidant woke up one day and changed completely. But inside the avoidant, a battle is taking place. Part of them wants the connection. Another part fears what that connection might eventually require. One of the strongest fears many avoidants carry is the fear of dependence. They worry that getting too close to someone will make them lose control over their own emotions. They fear becoming reliant on another person for happiness, security, or validation. Even when they care deeply about someone, they may resist getting too attached because attachment itself feels risky. To them, emotional dependence can feel like vulnerability, and vulnerability can feel unsafe. As a result, they often create invisible barriers that prevent relationships from becoming too emotionally intense. Control also plays a major role. Many avoidants feel safest when they believe they are in control of the emotional distance within a relationship. When they decide how close someone gets, they feel comfortable. When someone else starts demanding more closeness, more communication, or more emotional access, their sense of control begins to disappear. This can trigger anxiety that they may not even fully understand themselves. Instead of expressing that anxiety directly, they often withdraw. They create distance to restore a sense of safety. This is where emotional distancing becomes one of their most common coping mechanisms. Rather than confronting uncomfortable feelings, they move away from them. They stay busy. They focus on work. They distract themselves. They convince themselves that the relationship is moving too fast. Sometimes they focus on minor flaws in their partner. Sometimes they become emotionally unavailable without realizing it. These behaviors are not always conscious decisions. Often they are automatic protective responses that developed over many years. Another pattern frequently seen in avoidance is what many people describe as the push-pull cycle. They move closer when they feel lonely. They move away when they feel vulnerable. They seek connection when they miss someone. They retreat when intimacy becomes too intense. This creates a confusing experience for the people involved with them. One week, everything feels secure. The next week, it feels uncertain. One moment, the avoidant seems fully invested. The next moment, they appear distant and detached. This inconsistency is not always a sign that they do not care. In many cases, it reflects the ongoing conflict happening inside them. That conflict can be difficult for others to understand, because avoidants often want love just as much as anyone else. They want companionship. They want trust. They want emotional support. They want meaningful relationships. The difference is that they fear what those relationships require. Love requires vulnerability. Love requires openness. Love requires emotional exposure. Love requires allowing another person to matter. And for someone who has spent years protecting themselves from emotional risk, those requirements can feel overwhelming. This is why many avoidants find themselves trapped between two opposing desires. They want closeness, but fear losing independence. They want connection, but fear vulnerability. They want intimacy, but fear emotional dependence. They move toward relationships because they crave connection. Then they pull away because connection begins to feel threatening. This creates an exhausting cycle that can continue for years if it remains unaddressed. Unfortunately, most people respond to this cycle in ways that make it worse. When an avoidant starts withdrawing, the natural reaction is often to move closer. The partner becomes worried. They notice the emotional distance. They feel insecure. They want answers. They want reassurance. They want the relationship to return to how it was before. So they increase their efforts. They send more messages. They ask more questions. They try harder to reconnect. From their perspective, these actions make perfect sense. They care about the relationship and want to fix the problem. But this is often where things begin to unravel. The more the avoidant pulls away, the more the other person chases. The more the other person chases, the more trapped the avoidant feels. The more trapped they feel, the further they retreat. Both people believe they are solving the problem, yet both are unknowingly making it worse. Many people begin over-explaining this stage. They try to convince the avoidant that the relationship is worth saving. They explain their intentions repeatedly. They defend their feelings. They provide endless reassurance. They hope that if they can just communicate clearly enough, the avoidant will stop withdrawing. But excessive explanation often creates additional pressure. Instead of feeling safer, the avoidant feels overwhelmed by the emotional intensity. Others begin demanding reassurance. They ask where the relationship is going. They ask why communication has changed. They ask for certainty. They ask for emotional commitment. While these questions are understandable, they can trigger the avoidant's deepest fears. The avoidant starts feeling cornered. They start feeling responsible for emotions they are struggling to manage themselves. Their instinct is often to escape rather than engage. Then comes the most common response of all: trying harder. Many people believe effort can solve every relationship problem. If the avoidant becomes distant, they become more available. If the avoidant communicates less, they communicate more. If the avoidant seems uncertain, they become even more committed. Yet this increased effort often has the opposite effect. The avoidant interprets the growing intensity as pressure. Pressure creates discomfort. Discomfort activates their defenses. Their walls become stronger. Their emotional distance increases. This is why the dynamic feels so frustrating. The actions that seem logical to one person feel threatening to the other. Both people become trapped in a cycle neither understands. And this is exactly where the self-respecting empath enters the picture. Unlike many people, this empath does not respond to distance by abandoning themselves. They do not panic when someone pulls away. They do not immediately chase. They do not beg for attention. They do not lose themselves trying to earn love. This does not mean they stop caring. In fact, the self-respecting empath cares deeply. They are emotionally aware. They understand feelings. They recognize pain. They can often sense what others are experiencing even when nothing is being said. Their empathy remains intact. Their compassion remains intact. The difference is that their empathy is balanced by boundaries. They understand a truth that many people learn only after years of heartbreak. Caring about someone does not require sacrificing yourself for them. The self-sacrificing empath often believes love means enduring everything. They tolerate unhealthy behavior. They excuse emotional unavailability. They remain available no matter how little they receive in return. They convince themselves that patience alone will eventually change the other person. The people-pleasing empath focuses on keeping everyone comfortable. They avoid conflict. They ignore their own needs. They constantly adjust themselves to maintain harmony. The rescuing empath tries to heal everyone. They see potential. They see wounds. They see hidden pain. They make it their mission to save the other person from themselves. The self-respecting empath operates differently. They can recognize someone's struggles without taking responsibility for fixing them. They can offer understanding without abandoning their standards. They can show compassion without accepting mistreatment. They can love deeply without losing themselves. This changes everything. When an avoidant begins withdrawing, the self-respecting empath notices it. They do not ignore reality. They do not pretend everything is fine. But they also do not immediately panic. They remain grounded. They communicate clearly. They express themselves honestly. Then they allow the other person to make their own choices. This calmness is unfamiliar to many avoidants. They are often accustomed to people reacting emotionally when distance appears. They expect pursuit. They expect pressure. They expect attempts to pull them back into the relationship. The self-respecting empath does not follow that script. And because they do not follow the script, the avoidant suddenly finds themselves in unfamiliar territory. The dynamic can no longer be controlled in the same way. The patterns that usually repeat begin to break down. The avoidant expects pursuit. It never comes. The avoidant expects emotional pressure. It never arrives. The avoidant expects someone to keep proving their worth. Instead, they encounter someone who already knows their worth. This creates uncertainty. For perhaps the first time, the avoidant loses predictability. The self-respecting empath also reflects a level of emotional maturity that is difficult to ignore. They do not play games. They do not manipulate. They do not create drama to force attention. They remain calm even when disappointed. They communicate directly even when emotions are involved. Their behavior highlights the difference between healthy connection and unhealthy emotional patterns. The avoidant begins seeing a relationship dynamic that feels different from what they expected. There is no smothering. There is no desperate pursuit. There is no attempt to control. The empath maintains their own life, their own goals, and their own identity. This reduces one of the avoidant's greatest fears, the fear of losing independence. Many avoidants worry that intimacy will consume them. They fear becoming trapped inside someone else's emotional world. The self-respecting empath quietly demonstrates that closeness does not require losing freedom. And when that empath eventually decides to leave because their efforts are not being matched, they leave differently than most people. There is no revenge, no manipulation, no endless arguments, no dramatic attempts to force guilt. They leave with dignity, and that quiet departure often creates a deeper impact than any emotional confrontation ever could. Because for the first time, the avoidant is left alone with the one thing they spend so much energy trying to escape, their own feelings. This is where the story takes an interesting turn. Most people assume that once an avoidant creates distance, the emotional connection simply disappears. They assume the avoidant moves on without thinking twice. They assume that because the avoidant appears calm on the outside, there is no emotional process taking place beneath the surface. But appearances can be misleading. In many situations, the most significant emotional shifts happen after the distance has already been created. The avoidant may look unaffected. They may appear focused on other things. They may throw themselves into work, hobbies, routines, or distractions. Yet when the self-respecting empath exits the cycle of chasing, a new experience often begins inside the avoidant. It is not always immediate. Sometimes it takes days, sometimes weeks, sometimes even longer. But eventually a series of questions starts appearing in places where certainty once existed. The first question often arrives quietly. Why am I still thinking about them? This question can be surprisingly uncomfortable. The avoidant expected the distance to bring relief. They expected space to solve the problem. They expected separation to make things easier. Instead, thoughts of the empath continue appearing. Small memories return unexpectedly. Conversations replay in their mind. Moments they once dismissed suddenly feel important. The empath's presence lingers in a way they did not anticipate. Then another question begins to form. Why didn't they chase me? This question carries more weight than it may seem. Many avoidants become familiar with certain relationship patterns over time. When distance appears, people usually react. They pursue, they demand explanations. They fight to restore the connection. They try to prove their commitment. The avoidant has often seen this pattern before. It becomes predictable. But the self-respecting empath does not follow that pattern. They communicate honestly. They make their intentions clear. Then they step back. They respect themselves enough not to force a relationship that is no longer being equally invested in. This creates confusion. The avoidant expects pursuit. Instead, they encounter acceptance. The avoidant expects pressure. Instead, they encounter calmness. The avoidant expects resistance. Instead, they encounter dignity because the expected response never arrives. The avoidant loses the ability to place the empath into a familiar category. The situation no longer fits the script they understand. Then another thought begins to surface. Why did they seem different? At first, this question may focus on small details. The avoidant remembers how the empath communicated. They remember how conflicts were handled. They remember the absence of manipulation. They remember the emotional stability. They remember the patience. They remember the kindness that did not come with endless demands. Gradually, they begin comparing that experience to other relationships from the past. Parts become visible. Some people wanted attention. Some people wanted validation. Some people wanted control. But this empath wanted connection without control. They wanted honesty without pressure. They wanted closeness without losing themselves. The difference becomes harder to ignore. And then perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all begins to emerge. Why do I miss them? For someone who spends much of their life protecting themselves from emotional vulnerability, this question can feel deeply unsettling. Missing someone requires acknowledging emotional attachment. It requires recognizing value. It requires admitting that another person's presence mattered. This is precisely the type of emotional territory many avoidants spend years trying to avoid. But now they are standing directly in front of it. The usual distractions become less effective. The usual defenses become less convincing. The usual explanations begin losing their power. For perhaps the first time in a long time, the avoidant starts confronting feelings they would normally escape. This confrontation creates discomfort. There is no way around it. Growth rarely feels comfortable. Growth challenges existing beliefs. Growth exposes blind spots. Growth forces people to examine behaviors they have justified for years. The avoidant may begin reflecting on patterns that once felt normal. They may notice how often they withdrew when relationships became serious. They may notice how frequently they confused vulnerability with weakness. They may notice how often they expected others to adapt, while rarely questioning their own behavior. These realizations are not pleasant. In fact, they can feel deeply uncomfortable. But discomfort is not always a sign that something is wrong. Sometimes discomfort is evidence that something important is finally being understood. For years, the avoidant may have believed that distance was the solution to emotional discomfort. Every time vulnerability appeared, distance provided temporary relief. Every time intimacy felt overwhelming, withdrawal restored a sense of control. But the self-respecting empath creates a different outcome. Their departure removes the usual cycle. There is no endless pursuit to distract from self-reflection. There is no dramatic conflict to focus on. There is simply space. And within that space, awareness begins growing. This does not mean every avoidant suddenly transforms. Not everyone responds the same way. Some continue repeating familiar patterns. Some continue avoiding difficult emotions. Some continue running from vulnerability. But others begin asking questions they never asked before. And questions have power. Questions create curiosity. Curiosity creates awareness. Awareness creates change. The avoidant starts looking inward rather than outward. Instead of asking what was wrong with the relationship, they begin asking what role they played within it. Instead of focusing on what the other person lacked, they begin examining what they feared. Instead of blaming circumstances, they begin recognizing patterns. This process is often slow. It happens quietly. No dramatic announcement marks its arrival. Yet it represents one of the most significant psychological shifts an avoidant can experience. Because for the first time, they are no longer running from themselves. And this is exactly what makes the self-respecting empath so different from many other people. Most individuals enter relationships carrying an invisible goal. They want to be chosen. They want approval. They want validation. They want proof that they are worthy. As a result, much of their behavior becomes focused on earning acceptance. If someone pulls away, they try harder. If someone becomes distant, they become more available. If someone withdraws, they work even harder to prove their value. The self-respecting empath approaches relationships from an entirely different place. They are not searching for validation. They are searching for alignment. This distinction changes everything. Validation asks, "Do you approve of me?" Alignment asks, "Are we right for each other?" Validation places power in someone else's hands. Alignment keeps responsibility balanced between both people. The self-respecting empath understands that compatibility cannot be forced. Connections cannot be negotiated into existence. Mutual effort cannot be replaced by one person's sacrifice. As a result, they evaluate relationships differently. They are not constantly trying to convince someone to stay. They are paying attention to whether both people are moving in the same direction. This creates a level of emotional stability that many avoidants rarely encounter. Another major difference appears in how they approach rejection. Many people fight desperately to be chosen. Their sense of worth becomes tied to another person's decision. If someone leaves, they feel broken. If someone withdraws, they feel inadequate. If someone becomes distant, they assume they are not enough. The self-respecting empath chooses themselves first. This does not mean they are selfish. It does not mean they lack compassion. It simply means they refuse to abandon their own value because someone else fails to recognize it. They understand that another person's inability to show up consistently does not determine their worth. They understand that love should not require constant self-sacrifice. They understand that healthy relationships involve mutual investment. Because of this, they can walk away when necessary without losing themselves in the process. This quality often surprises avoidance. The avoidant expects endless pursuit. Instead, they encounter someone who respects themselves enough to stop chasing. The avoidant expects emotional dependence. Instead, they encounter emotional strength. The avoidant expects desperation. Instead, they encounter self-respect. Another difference becomes visible when challenges arise. Many people ignore red flags because they fear losing the relationship. They minimize unhealthy behavior. They excuse repeated patterns. They overlook warning signs. They convince themselves things will improve if they simply remain patient. The self-respecting empath honors boundaries. They pay attention to actions. They notice inconsistencies. They recognize when effort is no longer mutual. Most importantly, they trust themselves enough to respond appropriately. Boundaries are not walls. Boundaries are not punishments. Boundaries are not attempts to control others. Boundaries are expressions of self-respect. They communicate what someone is willing to accept and what they are not. The self-respecting empath understands this deeply. Their boundaries allow them to remain compassionate without becoming self-destructive. This distinction changes the entire relationship dynamic, because once someone stops abandoning themselves, they become much harder to manipulate, much harder to confuse, much harder to control. And this leads to a lesson that extends far beyond avoidance, relationships, or attachment styles. Many people spend years focusing on how to make others stay, how to make others choose them, how to make others recognize their value. But real emotional power comes from a different source. It comes from becoming emotionally whole. The goal is not to become irresistible. The goal is not to become unforgettable. The goal is not to make someone regret losing you. Those outcomes may happen, but they are not the point. The real transformation occurs when your sense of worth no longer depends on another person's behavior, when someone's inconsistency no longer determines your confidence, when someone's inability to love fully no longer makes you question your value. That is where freedom begins. Healthy empathy is often misunderstood. Many people believe empathy means giving endlessly. They believe empathy means tolerating everything. They believe empathy means putting everyone else's needs first. But healthy empathy is not self-abandonment. Healthy empathy is understanding another person's struggles while still honoring your own needs. It is compassion without losing yourself. It is kindness without sacrificing your identity. It is patience without accepting endless emotional neglect. The strongest empaths understand this balance. They can care deeply without becoming consumed. They can love fully without losing perspective. They can support others without carrying responsibilities that do not belong to them. That balance creates a quiet strength. A strength that does not need attention. A strength that does not need approval. A strength that remains steady even when relationships become uncertain. And that is why the empath who impacts avoidance the most is rarely the loudest person in the room. Not the neediest, not most persistent, not the one making the biggest emotional sacrifices. It is the empath who understands their own worth, the empath who can remain open without becoming dependent, the empath who can love deeply without abandoning themselves. The empath who knows when to stay and when to leave. The empath who understands that genuine connection cannot be forced. The empath who refuses to chase what is unwilling to walk beside them. And that combination leaves an impression that many avoidants carry long after the relationship itself has ended. And perhaps that is the biggest lesson of all. The empath who changes an avoidant's life is not the one who sacrifices everything to keep the relationship alive. It is the one who understands that real love should never come at the cost of self-respect. They care deeply, but they do not chase endlessly. They stay open, but they do not abandon themselves. And in doing so, they often leave a deeper impact than they ever realize. Now we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever dealt with an avoidant personality? Were you the empath who kept chasing, hoping things would change? Or did you eventually reach a point where you chose self-respect and walked away with dignity? Share your experience in the comments below. Your story might help someone else who is going through the same struggle right now. If you found value in this video and enjoy exploring the deeper side of psychology, empathy, relationships, and human behavior, make sure to give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our future videos. And if this message resonated with you, share it with a friend, family member, or fellow empath who needs to hear it today. Remember, the strongest empath is not the one who holds on the longest. It is the one who knows their worth, protects their peace, and never loses themselves while loving others. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.